Hello and welcome to Opt to Thrive, episode 43, The Silent Bone Crisis Affecting Midlife Women, a bone health conversation all women need to hear.
Welcome to Opt to Thrive, your go-to podcast for women's wellness in midlife, designed to educate, support, and inspire you to live your very best life. And now your host, Dr. Karina Sims.
So, sitting in the sunroom today, the gray sky has started to part and show us some blue sky today. Typical Riverland spring in that we've got a few little showers, never really get much rain, and a few cool days, and then we get like a 40-degree day. It's really fun. But, that's typical around here. Today was pretty exciting for me because I was sitting in the sunroom having my coffee this morning, and my husband appeared from the fig trees with 4 massive, big, fresh figs right off the tree. Amazing. They're like as big as tennis balls. So cool. So fig season is starting, and I will be a happy girl now for at least a few months. I can also see, looking out the sunroom window, the peach tree. I might have to sneak out there today because the last time I looked, those were not ripe. But from where I'm sitting now, they're looking pretty orangey. So I might have to go out and grab one of those today. So today's topic is very different from the one that I had been working on for a little while now. I've been doing some research on wearable health trackers because I'm really interested in knowing more about the validity and the reliability of them. And I know a lot of you are going to be interested in that too. So I promise that I'm going to come back to it. But something else this week has really got me fired up. So I'm taking a totally different direction entirely today. This topic is so important, and I have touched on it here and there, but today I want to break it right open. I want to continue to get this message out in a way that makes each one of you listening to me appreciate the importance and the timeliness in addressing this issue. So a little background information. In this past year in particular, we who live in regional communities have started to have more access to bone density scans. Until recent times, at least here in my rural community, we only had access once a year to what we call the bone bus. It travels down from Adelaide, from one of the major hospitals there, and it parks out in front of our hospital, as it does in lots of little regional areas around the state. And so we have this very little window of time to get our patients in once a year. And every year, some of my patients miss out, and then we have to wait for the next year. But now we've got these private services who are starting to make the rounds as well. And they're going to be around the Riverland a couple of times over a few months, which is pretty cool. And so now there's more opportunities to get my patients in for a scan. And as you have probably picked up along the way, I've been hot on getting these scans for my patients, even if it means that they don't actually qualify for a Medicare rebate and they need to pay for it out of their own pocket, because I want to be on the front foot when it comes to bone health. And there's so many reasons for that. Some of them we've talked about before. We're going to talk about more of them today. So now, of course, I do screen my patients. I'm not just sending everyone that comes through my door in for a bone density scan. I screen them, and then I make a recommendation based on that screening. I do, however, have a pretty low threshold for recommending a bone density scan because I know how important it is for a woman to know where she is with her bone health. And I know that if she wasn't overly motivated to do the things that she needs to do to protect her bones before, if she is then shown objective evidence that her bones are starting to deteriorate and that she can do something about it, she's much more motivated to do what she needs to do. So I'm starting to get some of these results back. And the day that I decided to change direction with the topic of this podcast was the day that each and every result I got on that particular day was either positive for osteopenia so that stage before it becomes full-blown osteoporosis, thin bones, or full-blown osteoporosis. And these women are not the women that are meeting the Medicare criteria for a rebate. These women are in their 50s and their 60s. So today, I want to give you the information you need to decide whether you too should be having a bone density scan. So you've got the confidence to advocate for yourself with your own doctor and getting a referral. We're going to talk more about bone health in general, what it means, why you might care, what we're doing that might be negatively affecting our bones, what does and does not work to build and maintain and protect our bones. So let's get started with some statistics. 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men over the age of 50 are going to experience at least one osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. Some sources actually say 1 in 2 women. I want you to hear what I have to say next. I want you to really take this in. Your risk as a woman for having an osteoporotic fracture is higher than you having a heart attack, a stroke, getting dementia, or even breast cancer. 67% of Australians over the age of 50 have poor bone health, so 2/3 of those have osteopenia and 1/3 have osteoporosis. Can I just say that again? The majority of us over the age of 50 have either thinning bones or already thin bones. And this number has increased by 34% since 2012. It's estimated that by 2033, it's not a long ways away, kind of weird to think about, but not a long ways away, it's estimated there's going to be 1 fracture every 30 seconds in Australia. Now, we've talked about hip fractures before. We know that women make up the majority of those who have hip fractures. So 75% of the people who have a hip fracture are women. And depending on the resource, we know that somewhere between 20 and 30% of those who fracture a hip will die in the first year after that fracture. Another 30, some sources say up to 60%, are going to need ongoing assistance. So they're going to have some loss of independence. We can truly say that hip fractures are almost always associated with some degree of chronic pain, reduced mobility, and some degree of increasing dependence on others. But what we haven't really talked about are the other osteoporotic fractures and how they can impact us, because hip fractures are not the only one. In fact, the most common osteoporotic fracture is the vertebral fracture. So that's a fracture in your spine. Up to 28% of Australian women over the age of 50 are going to have a vertebral fracture. Now, some of these women aren't even going to know that they've had a fracture. And in one way, I suppose that's a good thing because there isn't overt suffering involved. But without knowing that there's been a vertebral fracture, you're probably not going to know that your bones are getting thin, and then you're not going to be prompted to seek treatment, which could then prevent further bone loss in all the other bones in your body too. I had a patient recently mention that her family teases her that she's shrinking. She had a little giggle as I was measuring her. It's one of the things that I do in the menopause clinic is check the height, right? And a waist circumference and a weight. Now that prompted us to get a bone density scan. There is some natural loss of height that comes with aging. It's true, it's going to happen. But if it's significant, let's say if it's more than a few centimeters or if it's really rapid, then it really needs to be looked into with some imaging, making sure that there hasn't been a vertebral fracture. Because as I said, it could go unnoticed and then we've lost an opportunity to treat and protect the rest of your bones. Now, once there's been one vertebral fracture, there is an increased risk of having either another vertebral fracture or some other type of fracture in the next 2 years. So yes, some of these fractures may go undetected, some of these vertebral fractures, but then there are those that cause significant pain. And those that are hospitalized with their vertebral fracture often spend somewhere around 10 days in the hospital, and up to half of these are discharged to a care facility because, again, they're going to need some help with the activities of daily living. Pain will generally last for several weeks to a few months, but up to 1/3 of these patients could have pain for a year or longer. And I think one of the most concerning facts here is that these are fragility fractures. So that means these people aren't doing silly things like I did when I got on the kids' BMX bike at Easter camp and proved that I could still fly down a hill and over a homemade bike jump. No, these fractures, especially of the hip, are often just tripping over our own feet or a raised piece of sidewalk or a little bit of lifted carpet or losing your balance and falling sideways. I've seen them in the garden, on the sidewalk, and even in the house on a carpeted floor. But even worse, for vertebral fractures, most people get a fragility-related vertebral fracture just by doing regular, routine daily activities. Things like bending, lifting, some light object, or even minor movements like twisting. I had one patient who just rolled over in bed. Only about 1/4 to 1/3 of vertebral fractures are actually caused by falls. The next most common fracture site is the wrist, and we're seeing more and more of these requiring an operation to put them back into place, somewhere around 30 to 40%. And then you have pelvic fractures and ankle fractures and humerus fractures, which are the upper arm bone, and none of these are pretty. So one important thing to realize here, and what I am trying to sing from the rooftops about, is that the time to act is now. If you're 30, 40, 50 plus, those bones don't get fragile overnight. We have a lot of power over what our bone health looks like. So please do not wait until the horse is bolted. And if you have, then it is what it is. But know that it is never too late to make a difference. All right, with that little pep talk, let's learn some things about these beautiful bones of yours and how we can keep them as healthy and strong as possible. Let's start at the beginning. Just a little bit of general bone biology. Now, our bones every day are being broken down and built back up. This is called bone remodeling. This remodeling is happening at thousands of sites all over your skeleton. We're replacing old or little damaged spots of bone to help maintain our skeletal integrity and also to keep your body's minerals balanced, things like calcium, phosphorus, and magnesium. We spend the first part of our lives doing more building up of bone than breaking down until about our late teens, early 20s, when we reach our peak bone mass. And then there's this slow, gradual shift where we start to see a little more breaking down than building up, and this slow, progressive decline in our bone density as we age. Now, for women, in those few years right before to a few years after the last menstrual period, whenever that may be, late 30s to mid 50s, this loss of bone really speeds up. And this is because of the decline in our estrogen levels. This decreased estrogen causes the cells that break down the bone to live longer and work faster. And it also causes the bone cells that make up the bone to not live as long. Eek! Now, there's lots of other things that can interfere with the balancing of the breaking down and building up too. So let's go over a few of those. Smoking. None of y'all should be smoking. Okay. Smoking also increases activity of the cells that break down bone, but also reduces estrogen levels in and of itself. So there's that estrogen mechanism we just talked about. Smoking also affects how well we can absorb calcium from our diet. And calcium, of course, is super important for our bones, and we'll talk more a bit about that in a minute. Now, having too much alcohol can also affect the function of the cells that form the new bone, as well as increase the breaking down of the bone. Now, how much alcohol is too much alcohol? If we're talking about osteoporosis, the data varies somewhat, And some of that is in the differences in how we measure a standard drink in different parts of the world. But it would generally be no more than 2 standard drinks on average per day. Now, I'll just remind you that the recommendation for alcohol intake in Australia is no more than 10 standard drinks in a week. Now, no surprises here, but having a low dietary calcium and low levels of vitamin D both stimulate more bone breakdown. If we don't have enough calcium for all the other things besides bone that our bodies use calcium for, then our bodies are going to go to our bones and take it from our bones. If you have a low body weight, so that's considered to be a BMI of less than 20, that's also a risk factor for osteoporosis, and that's thought to be related to a reduction of the estrogen that we make from adipose or fat tissue. So again, that estrogen mechanism. Rapid weight loss can also increase the risk of osteoporosis because when we lose weight, we're not just losing fat, and especially if it's rapid weight loss, we might lose even more muscle and bone as well. Anorexia nervosa, again, increases the risk of developing osteoporosis, makes sense. Being physically inactive increases our risk. We need that mechanical loading on our bone to stimulate the bone building activity. We're going to go into this in a bit more detail. I know, surprise, surprise, in a minute. But without this stimulation, the balance shifts more to the breaking down side of the equation than the building up side of the equation. There are also some medical conditions or medications that could put you at risk, and I'm going to list them in 2 different categories. Those that you're going to get a bone density scan covered by Medicare in Australia, and those that put you at risk, but they're not going to score you a free scan. I know, interesting. So let's start with, if you're over 50 and you have any of these conditions, you should have a bone density scan, but you're not going to get it covered under Medicare. Now, for context, a private scan, at least here in South Australia, my patients tell me they run roughly somewhere around $90. Okay, so if you have a family history of a hip fracture, you yourself have recurrent falls, you've got a low body weight, we talked about that one before. Now, interestingly with this one, the Practitioner's Toolkit for Managing Menopause, which is a resource developed at the Monash University with Professor Susan Davis here in Australia, we've had her on the show before, it actually includes normal body weight on this list as well. If you have HIV, if you're on SSRI medication for anxiety or depression, if you've got type 1 or type 2 diabetes, if you have multiple myeloma, if you've had an organ or a bone marrow transplant, though if you have had prolonged steroid use, we'll talk about that in a minute, then you'll probably have your scan covered. If you've had breast cancer and you're on aromatase inhibitors, if you're being treated with some anti-epileptic medications, and then the Practitioner's Toolkit that I just mentioned also lists things like being malnourished, having limited mobility or immobility, poor overall health, and then it lists, which makes sense as we talked about before, smoking and alcohol more than 2 standard drinks a day. Those should be considered for a scan. Now, these are the things that are going to earn you a free scan. If you're over 70, you're going to get a free scan. And traditionally, that was kind of the general rule that we used. You had to be 70, we get you a scan. That's too late. And I think you've probably heard me say this before. We cannot wait until you're 70, okay? Now, otherwise, according to the criteria to get your scan covered under Medicare, if you're over 50 and you've had an early menopause, so remember that's the final menstrual period before the age of 45, if you've been on high-dose steroids for at least 4 months, if you have celiac disease or some type of malabsorption disorder of your gut, rheumatoid arthritis, hyperparathyroidism, so not the thyroid, it's a little gland right next to the thyroid, hyperthyroidism, not hypothyroidism, so it's the one that goes too fast, not too slow, not the one that you actually need thyroxine hormone. Chronic kidney disease or liver disease, And for men, if they've had treatment for prostate cancer with androgen deprivation therapy, or they've got low testosterone secondary to hypogonadism, then they should be considered for a scan too. Now, in my research, I did see that there has been some recent funding to try and improve access and possibly maybe even some subsidies to help people pay for these scans in regional areas. So it will be interesting to see how that goes and how that money is allocated. At this point, there seems to be this focus on diagnosis of osteoporosis. I would really like to see more focus on prevention and getting in early and seeing it when those bones are starting to deteriorate. Because if we can get in then, we have more of an opportunity to stop it and hopefully reverse it, which is much harder to do once we've crossed that line into osteoporosis. So then the question becomes, if you don't fit the criteria that I've outlined for getting a scan, do you still ask for one? Now, my personal opinion, again, based on the rationale I've already given, is that if you are postmenopausal, remember, definition of postmenopausal is 12 months since your last period, and you're willing to pay for a private baseline scan, then I think it's a good idea. The only issue I see is if it is a situation where appointments are very limited and you're potentially taking the spot of someone who is at known high risk. But the request forms will ask your doctor to provide a Medicare item number or a clinical indication. So my hope is that there is some triaging being done during the booking process to ensure that those that are at high risk are getting their scans first. But I don't know for sure. Now, let's move on to the things that we can actually do to help protect our bones to prevent osteopenia or osteoporosis. The first thing we're going to talk about is nutrition. Now, I'm sure it's no surprise, calcium's a superstar here when it comes to healthy bones. Almost 99% of the calcium in our bodies is found in our bones. But there are a lot of supporting roles and mechanisms that need to be working well together to make sure our bodies can make the most out of the calcium. Calcium does have other functions besides keeping our bones strong. We need it for healthy functioning of our heart, our muscles, blood, and nerves. Our bones act like a calcium bank. If we aren't getting enough calcium in our diet, the body's just going to take it from your bones to supply those needs. And obviously, if we take too much, we affect that building up and breakdown balance, and we get more breaking down than building up. But it's not really as simple as making sure you're getting the recommended daily amount of calcium in your diet, because you could be getting enough, but there may be other things that are affecting how much you are absorbing it. We talked about some of these things earlier: medical conditions like gut issues and chronic kidney disease, lifestyle factors like smoking and alcohol intake, and you may have even heard that excessive caffeine can affect calcium absorption. Now, I'm not a huge coffee drinker. I do have a cup most mornings, but I thought that there would be a few of you perking your ears up when I mentioned caffeine, or maybe you've heard this and maybe you've gone off your morning coffee because of it. So I did do a little extra rabbit hole exploration around this one, and it turns out if you're drinking 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day and you're meeting the recommended daily calcium intake, then you're probably okay. It's generally when we get to over 4 cups a day where we may need to be paying a little more attention, and really it looks like just making sure you are definitely getting the daily recommended amount of calcium in your diet should be enough. So how much is enough? What are the recommendations? It's estimated that only 20 to 40% of us are actually meeting recommendations, which are: before menopause, it's recommended that you have 1,000 milligrams of calcium, or about 3 serves of dairy or a dairy alternative every day. After menopause, the daily recommendation goes to 1,300 milligrams, which is about 4 serves of dairy. I think, though, that given the acceleration of bone loss that starts even before that final period, I recommend, if you're perimenopausal or you even think you're perimenopausal, then aim for 4. So what does 4 servings of dairy look like? A serve of dairy is equal to a cup of milk, 2 slices of cheese, or 40 grams of hard cheese, which is about the size of a matchbox. or 200 grams of yogurt, which is a little more than a standard single serve tub. So those are usually around 150 to 170 grams. Other foods that are equivalent to a serve of dairy are 100 grams of tofu and a cup of dairy milk alternative like soy or oat milk that has 100 milligrams or more of added calcium per 100 mils. Now, if you're trying to avoid dairy, it can be a bit harder to meet your calcium target, but check the labels on some of your dairy alternatives and see if there are options that are supplemented with calcium. Lots of other foods do contain calcium, but not many will be as good as dairy, and you usually have to eat a lot more, obviously, to get that much calcium. There is a handy calcium calculator on the International Osteoporosis Foundation website. You can Google it, but I will put a link in the show notes for you as well, in case you want to check it out. Now, if you find you're not getting enough calcium in your diet, then the recommendation is that you should add in a supplement to make up the difference, which would generally be one 500 to 600 milligram calcium tablet a day. Now, a little note here that more is definitely not always better, and this is one of those times. Yes, I know, some of us do have those husbands who take 3 Panadol instead of 2 because it must be better to take more. But this is not the time. Getting our calcium from our diet is preferred over supplementation because there are some risks with supplementation and there can be some side effects. There's a risk of kidney stones, and these supplements can cause constipation and bloating. And there are also mixed reports about increasing the risk of cardiovascular disease because of the risk of calcium depositing in our arteries, so these little calcifications. So it is advised to be cautious. Get it from your diet if you can, but if you can't and you need a supplement, take it. Just only take what you need. Now, I mentioned some supporting roles for calcium absorption, and the biggest one would have to be vitamin D. We cannot have a discussion around bone health without talking about vitamin D. Vitamin D helps us absorb most of the calcium we get from the gut. It's so interesting to talk to my Canadian friends at the Fit Physician, especially those who live like really far northwest. They tell me that a lot of them are vitamin D deficient and are on supplements. Here in Australia, we're pretty fortunate because we have a natural source of vitamin D pretty much on tap all year long. Most of our vitamin D comes from the sun. Now, the obvious drawback is the risk of skin cancer. So we do need to avoid those nasty peak UV times between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. And generally speaking, if we get 5 to 15 minutes of sun on our bare hands, our arms and face, and we're doing that 4 to 6 times a week, then that should be enough. As I said, though, that's a general recommendation, and there are some other factors to take into consideration, like where you live in Australia and the time of year. If you're really interested in knowing exactly how much sun you should be getting, then you may want to check out the map on the Osteoporosis Australia website. It really breaks it all down for you. We can get some vitamin D in our diet, but it's really only about 5 to 10%, and it's found in things like salmon, tuna, mackerel, and herring, and smaller amounts in beef liver, cheese, and egg yolks. And interestingly, I didn't know this until now, but here in Australia, vegetable oil spreads, margarines, by law, need to be fortified with vitamin D. And some milks are also fortified with vitamin D, but that isn't mandatory here like it is in some other countries, like the States, Canada, and Finland. Now, there are some things that put you more at risk of vitamin D deficiency, and I think you need to be aware of them. So let's quickly whip through those. If you've got naturally dark skin, because the pigment melanin reduces the skin's ability to produce vitamin D from the sunlight. If you're unable to be outdoors during daylight hours, if you work night shift or you're wearing protective clothing for work all day when you're outdoors or covering your body for other reasons like religious or cultural reasons, if you're avoiding the sun because of medical reasons like a history of skin cancer, or if you're over 70, because as we age, we get less and less efficient at producing vitamin D through our skin. And if you have a health condition that affects vitamin D absorption from the diet, like we talked about, those bowel conditions, or if you've had gastric bypass surgery. Now, in terms of other nutrients that are important, protein is an important one, but calcium and vitamin D are the most important when it comes to bone health. And then there's magnesium and zinc, but your levels of those should be pretty good if you have a well-rounded, varied diet and a normal, well-functioning gut. And now for my favorite part. Other than nutrition, what do we need to be doing to keep our bones healthy and strong? This is where there is probably the most confusion. And today, I really want to clear it up for you. Some people are making this way too complicated. This part is so important. The bottom line is that the absolute gold standard in keeping your bones healthy and strong is doing resistance exercise. When I ask my patients if they're doing resistance exercise, many of them will say, yes, I walk regularly. Now, girls, I get it. I love walking too, and you know I do. If you've been listening to me for any period of time, you know I walk regularly, and I find it incredibly therapeutic for my heart and my soul, but it really is not going to be enough to keep our muscles or our bones strong. Even if you're walking with a weighted vest, it's not going to be enough. I need you to hear me though. If you enjoy walking, please keep walking. But please also consider adding in some resistance training. I'll talk more in a minute about how to do that. Now, the second most common answer I get is, yes, I do Pilates. And look, Pilates is going to be probably better than walking for bone health, but again, it's not the most effective way to build muscle and bone. The reformer is going to be a little bit better than mat Pilates, and they are both amazing for mobility, balance, and flexibility, but not the best choice for protecting your bone health. And again, if you enjoy Pilates, please keep going, but also consider adding in some resistance training. So what exactly do I mean by resistance training? Now, don't worry, it doesn't absolutely have to be smashing a 20-kilo dumbbell in the gym, though it could be if that's where you're at with your level of strength and fitness and knowledge. Resistance training is defined as any form of exercise where muscles work against an external force to increase strength and stimulate bone growth. So this could be lifting weights, dumbbells, barbells, or weight machines, using resistance bands, or even doing body weight exercises like squats, lunges, and push-ups. The key to doing resistance training to improve muscle strength and bone health is to do something called progressive overload. This just means that you start where you are. So if that's body weight exercises, even standing from sitting and doing that repeatedly, and then over time you continue to progress and increase the challenge to the muscle, that's resistance training, progressive overload. Now, this might mean when you start, you can only do 8 repetitions of the exercise, and that's it. But then over time, you might be able to do 8, but do this 2 or 3 times through. Then maybe you can do 10, and then maybe 12. The key is to continually, slowly progress and get stronger. It's also important to do exercises to work all the major muscle groups in your body, and that you're doing it in a way that is structured. So doing some random upper body workout occasionally is not likely to be overly helpful. But doing the same workout with some variations of the exercises along the way regularly over time so you can see that progression in your strength allows you to consistently work the muscle groups and continually challenge them in a way that encourages them to grow. And if we're stimulating our muscles in this way that are attached to our bones, then we are also stimulating our bones. Now, there are some influencers who recommend lifting very heavy weights, and some may send the message that anything less than heavy is a waste of time. This is simply not true. In fact, lifting too heavy is a recipe for injury unless you're an experienced lifter or you have someone who can supervise your lifts to make sure that you're doing it correctly before lifting too much weight. There are also some influencers who really push the weighted vest. One of the things a weighted vest could be good for, though, is adding resistance to some of your resistance exercises. For instance, if your body weight squat is getting easy and you need to increase the resistance, then doing them with a weighted vest could do that. You may have also seen some recommendations for doing jump training or plyometrics, like jumping up onto a box. Again, these could be a recipe for injury, so I would be very mindful here. The good news is that the resistance training on its own is enough. We don't really have to be doing these higher impact exercises to get the bone benefits. But again, if you feel safe, you love doing it, keep doing it. If you listen to my recent podcast with Jo, she did some box jumps as she prepared to get back out onto the ski slopes, and it worked wonders for her. So if you like it, you want to keep doing it, keep doing it. Just be careful. Now, how often do we need to be doing our resistance training? If you do your program and you hit all of your muscle groups twice a week, this is going to be enough to maintain your muscles and to help protect your bones. 3 sessions, though, is even better. Now, I always recommend getting some guidance and putting a program together. There could be someone with adequate training at your local gym who can do this for you. If you already have osteopenia or osteoporosis or some other medical condition, then I highly recommend seeing an exercise physiologist. These visits can be partly funded through a GP management plan, so talk to your doctor, or through some private health funds. Okay, guys, this is what I have for you today. I hope that you now feel more empowered to advocate for yourself, or at least have the discussion with your GP about whether you should have a bone density scan. I hope that I've motivated you to have a look at your calcium intake, get your vitamin D checked, and dial in your exercise so you're getting enough stimulus to build those muscles and bones. One of my motives for creating my Midlife Reset program was pretty much all about this, to guide women through their nutrition and their exercise to help them improve their muscle and bone health, which is really ultimately helping them achieve their optimum body composition. Many women come to me just wanting to feel better, both mentally and physically in this midlife period. And part of the secret to doing this is working on their muscle health, which you can see from what we talked about today. Muscle health underpins so much more than just mobility and function and looking good. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to look good. And some women do come to me wanting to lose body fat, and that can definitely be a part of the overall process. But it often becomes secondary as they improve their physical and mental health and mindset. It's my absolute passion working with these women. It really lights me up. It's my favorite part of the week. If you're interested in being a part of it and working with me, just a heads up, I'm going to be opening the doors again in the new year for another group. And what perfect time to make a start, but the start of a fresh new year. I'll leave the link in the show notes below. Have a great week, everyone. And until then, I hope you opt to thrive.
The Opt to Thrive podcast is designed for information purposes only and is not engaged in the giving of medical advice. The information provided on the podcast should not be used for diagnosing or treating a health problem or disease. In no way should the information provided by Opt to Thrive be considered medical advice, and at all times the advice of a medical professional should supersede recommendations from Opt to Thrive. If you have or suspect you may have a health problem, you should consult your healthcare provider. The views expressed in this podcast are purely that of Dr. Sims and do not in any way reflect those of the institutions she contracts her medical services to.
Thank you for listening to Opt to Thrive. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate and share the podcast. You can visit our website at opttothrive.com and leave a comment for any subjects you would like to hear more about.